Quite expecting all of that sound to come out, but hey, it's a first for everything. I know you're still trying to connect, Nicole. It says that you're connecting to audio, so I don't want to rush this too much. Right now, it's just you and me, girl. We are it. And I've had 10 people sign up, so I have a feeling that other people are going to be joining eventually. But for right now, it's just us. So, hi. So one of the things that I like to do, and the reason that you're seeing my screen right now is because one of the things that I like doing when I do this is kind of bust some of the myth first so that I don't have to worry about answering those questions repeatedly because that does happen a lot. So, gosh, can't even hear me.
I forgot I needed my microphone over here. You probably didn't hear me at all. So your computer says that you are still connecting to audio there, Nicole. Um, if that's the case, I'm not going to be able to hear you, but you might still be able to hear me. I'm not sure. Anyway, part right now, you and I are it. There's 10 tickets sold for this, but you're the only one that has shown up. This is common when it comes to free events. So if it's just you and me, I'm all right with that too. While your computer is still kind of struggling with connecting to the audio, I'll go ahead and get started. But the whole reason that you're seeing my screen is because I like to bust a lot of the myths before I start answering the questions. That way, I don't have to answer the exact same questions every single time I do this. It can get a little frustrating for me. So, what is human trafficking? I always tell people this isn't something you want to look up on Wikipedia or on Google because these are fallible. They are run by multiple sources and the definition can change. Go somewhere like the Department of Homeland Security, where this is a definite definition that doesn't change or alter. So, human trafficking, as defined by the Department of Homeland Security, is considered the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act from another person. So, do you notice what's missing here? While there's no mention of what part of the world any of this is happening in, a lot of people think this only happens in third world countries, but that's not the case anymore. And there's no mention of age. This is really important to note because a lot of people automatically assume that human trafficking involves little kids being snatched up off the streets by bearded weirdos in windowless vans. Well, my husband is a weirdo with a beard, so we'll leave that part out. But, the greasy weirdos, let's call them that. But that's not the case anymore. And we'll get into that. But there's other things missing too. There's no mention of money. So prostitution does not equal human trafficking and vice versa, though there is an overlap in that world. There's no mention of transportation. You do not have to transport a person from one place to another for them to be a victim of trafficking. There's no mention of violence. You don't have to physically beat somebody or chain them down for them to be a victim of human trafficking. There's no mention of citizen status. So, citizenship, we're talking about border crossings. People are talking about all these people that are coming across the border being trafficked. Not all of them, no. And we'll get into that. There is a difference between human smuggling and human trafficking. There's no mention of gender. We automatically think this is happening mostly to little girls. In recent studies, the FBI have come up with much more staggering numbers that they assume approximately 49% of all victims of human trafficking are actually male, boys and men. And there's no mention of stranger danger. That's because the majority of people who are trafficked by people they already know. And we'll get into that too. But first, let's talk a little bit more about the human trafficking and human smuggling part, because that part, I get a lot of questions on that. So, human trafficking, of course, involves the exploiting men, women, or children for the purposes of forced labor or commercial sex acts, while human smuggling involves the daily provision of a service, typically transportation or fraudulent documentation, to an individual who voluntarily seeks to gain illegal entry into a foreign country. That is human smuggling. Now, I don't want to say that this doesn't exist together because it does. there are a very large number of people who are trying to seek their way into another country without having the legal documents to do so. And they're being exploited because of that. People are seeing this as a weakness and they're absolutely taking full uh, advantage of their situation. It's really terrible. But the crime of human trafficking does not require any movement whatsoever. If you remember, I'd mentioned something about transportation being the second bullet point here. Victims can be recruited and trafficked in their own homes, their own towns. I have a typo in here, but they can absolutely be taken advantage of right in their own place. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that too. By far, the most pervasive myth that I bust about human trafficking is that it always, or usually, or often involves kidnapping or physically forcing someone into this situation. In reality, most traffickers use psychological means like tricking somebody, defrauding them, lying them, manipulating, threatening them with credible threats, of course. And if we go back to that definition one more time, the use of force, that would be physical violence, right? Fraud or coercion. So when we're talking about fraud, you can fraud somebody into labor or commercial sex acts by offering them something and then not giving them that thing that you've offered them that enticed them to do this in the first place. For example, if somebody was going to be paid to act in a pornography, or if they were told that they were going to be paid to work on a sheep farm. We have a lot of human trafficking here in Colorado involving sheep farms. I don't want to get too much into that. But this type of trafficking happens when these people go and do these things that they've been promised this money for, and then they aren't receiving the money. As an example, even though I don't typically use this as an example, if somebody goes to perform in a pornographic film and they're offered $10,000 for their act and they're only paid $2,000 instead, this is still considered an act of fraud. And they are obtaining acts of commercial sex for their own benefit. So that is a form of human trafficking. That yes, they got paid. They did not get paid what they were promised. They were frauded into it. This is something that the legal system is still having a hard time catching up on. So human trafficking, this is a huge myth, only happens to people under the age of 18. Remember that hashtag that came out several years ago? Oh, save the children. In reality, human trafficking can happen to anyone at any age. In recent years here in Colorado, the youngest person to be pulled out of trafficking was only 3 months old, and the oldest was in her 70s. And I personally was 31 years old with a child of my own the last time I was trafficked. And another myth is that human trafficking means sex trafficking. No, I've already mentioned labor trafficking several times. In reality, experts worldwide believe that there are more situations of labor trafficking than of sex trafficking. In fact, it's greatly outnumbered. Sex trafficking makes up about 14% of trafficking worldwide. There's a much wider awareness of sex trafficking in the United States than there is of labor trafficking. And that's because sex sells. It always has. Local organizations just here in Colorado have worked on thousands of cases of trafficking involving foreign national survivors who are legally living and or working in the United States. And these include survivors of both sex and labor trafficking. However, many trafficking victims or survivors are just like me. Millions of people who are US citizens whose families have been here in the States for generations. Nobody is immune to this. People are not targeted because of their skin color, because of their hair color. They are targeted because they have a weakness that the trafficker can exploit. And we'll get into the weaknesses in a little bit. So trafficking, another myth is that it only happens to illegal or underground industries like drug industries, illegal firearms, underground brothels, that kind of stuff. But in reality, human trafficking cases have been reported and prosecuted in industries including restaurants, cleaning services, construction, factories, and so much more. Personally, I was trafficked by a police officer, but it was a man that I had known for 7 years. I've known people that have been trafficked by their own family members from their own homes and had nothing at all to do with any industry. And I was talking earlier about only women and girls can be victims of sex trafficking. It is about 50-50 these days. And commercial sex is human trafficking. This is absolutely false as well. In reality, all commercial sex involving a minor is considered human trafficking under the law now, thankfully. This is a relatively new development. But commercial sex involving an adult is human trafficking if the person providing commercial sex is doing so against his or her will as a result of force, fraud, or coercion. That's what I went through. And commercial sex does not always mean prostitution. It could be pornography. It could be revenge porn. I know about that one. I was made famous on a pornography website using revenge porn and other entertainment of a commercial nature and more. In fact, more than 85% of modern pornography is made using survivors and victims of human trafficking, just like me. If the trafficked person consented to their initial situation, then it can't be human trafficking because they knew better or they made bad choices. I've heard this a lot. In reality, initial consent to commercial sex or labor prior to the acts of force, fraud, or coercion, if the victim is a minor, of course, that doesn't have anything to do with this. It's not relevant. But their prior consent is not relevant to the crime if force, fraud, or coercion are used later on. Neither is the receipt of any payment. I brought up that thing about acting in a pornography. If somebody acts in a pornography, but they are not paid what they're promised, that is a type of fraud. So that is commercial sex, and that is human trafficking. Another myth is that people being trafficked are physically unable to leave their situations. They're locked up. They're held against their will. We see these pictures all over the internet of people standing there with chains over their wrists. They're crying children. In reality, that is sometimes the case. Very, very rarely ever the case. Usually people in trafficking situations stay for reasons that are far more complicated than that. Some don't have basic necessities to physically get out, such as transportation. They don't have anywhere to go. There's no safe place for them. Some are afraid for their safety, and many have been so effectively manipulated. A lot of them have been so manipulated that they don't even understand that what they're doing is called human trafficking or that they're even under the control of another person. And just like in cases of domestic violence, the most dangerous time in a victim's life is when they leave. Another myth is that labor trafficking is only a problem in developing countries. That is not the case. Labor trafficking occurs here in the United States and in other developed countries, but is reported at lower rates than sex trafficking. But why? Sex trafficking is only 14% of the issue worldwide. So the biggest problem we have with sex trafficking versus labor trafficking is that when people are performing a labor and they're not getting paid for it, they understand that what they're going through is illegal because this is something that we talk about. When people are being abused and raped and molested, they're told not to talk about it, and it's a dirty secret and it's filled with shame. So labor traffickers are living in this constant state of, I need to have more control over this person, while sex traffickers are less afraid because most people don't realize what is happening to them even has a name. So another myth is that traffickers target victims they don't know, like kidnappings. That's absolutely a myth. Most victims are trafficked by romantic partners or spouses or family members, including parents, grandparents, siblings, all kinds. But why don't we hear more about it? When conversations about sex trafficking exclude those with lived experience, are you really even getting the truth? You're hearing it from the news. When there's a political agenda, about half of the nation's population is completely alienated from this discussion. But only 2% of all victims escape with their lives. So that cuts back on a lot of actual voices that we're hearing. The average lifespan of a person in trafficking is only 7 years. Of those who escape, very few are willing to talk about it. Because of the prevailing myths, most victims don't realize that what they're going through was called trafficking at all. They weren't kidnapped. They weren't a child. Well, underage children, people under the age of 18, make up approximately 1/4 of all victims of human trafficking worldwide. But why don't more traffickers go to prison for what they've done? Well, the number of people prosecuted in the US for human trafficking more than doubled in 10 years, from 729 people to 1,672 people. When you're looking at the entire population of the US, that's still a relatively small number. But of the 1,197 defendants charged in federal court with human trafficking, 92% of them were male. That means there's 8% that weren't. Why is human trafficking so hard to fight? Well, many cases require numerous state and local and federal agencies to work together. That's always difficult. The laws associated are relatively new. There's a lack of precedent in case law. There's a lack of funding. There's very little to no cooperation from victims. They don't want to have to talk about this, especially in front of a bunch of strangers. It's hard enough to talk about a rape. Imagine talking about being raped for 7 years. Many of these traffickers can pay their own bill because they've made lots of money doing what it is that they did. That prompts states to begin to create legislature that can prevent this, but it's not in place yet. And often they intimidate the witnesses. They are able to continue their criminal enterprises from within the walls of jail or prison anyway. So what good is it doing? What about the list, though? Everybody always asks me about the list. There's a lot of people who've been upset for a very long time because that list of names hadn't come out. People want to know why. Well, there's a lot of reasons, but there's 3 that I can come up right away with. The statute of limitations will not allow an adult victim to seek legal action unless proceedings start within 18 months of the offense in Colorado and up to 2 years in some other states. But that's not very much time. In most cases, the statute of limitations ran out before the names were ever released. This is why we need to change these laws. There should be no statute of limitations when it comes to a sexually violent case. And the penalty for purchasing sex is about the same as driving over the limit line at a red light, about an $80 to $120 fine, depending on what state you're in. Can you believe that? And there was a high risk, very high risk of a lot of vigilante justice if that list of names came out while this was still in the news. So they just didn't. But what about those big sting busts? Well, think about the headlines. These are pretty disturbing. Check that out. This is just what I was able to drag up quickly. Those big sting busts. So who's getting arrested here? Who are you seeing? Well, you're seeing purchasers, you're seeing trafficked persons, and you're seeing the traffickers, right? These are the 3 people that are going to be involved in any kind of a sting bust like this. So let's take another look here. Let's grab that one from the bottom. Let's bring that front and center. 213 people arrested in a sex trafficking sting. Well, this one says human trafficking victim. This one says human trafficking victim. This one says human trafficking victim. This one is. The ones that say human trafficking victim, they're little pink things here. But I remember when they were prosecuted, it said here, of the people who were charged in federal court for human trafficking, 92% were male. So when we look back at this photo again, how many of these are female? How many of these do we think it's a possibility they might also be a human trafficking victim. So the pink ones, in all likelihood, are probably underage victims that they just didn't have the legal right to have their photos posted in the newspaper. So they target all the others. So let's talk again about who it is that we're seeing. Who's getting arrested? How many of them? Well, for the purchasers, we're seeing about 55% of the arrests are people who are going to purchase sex. The 45% trafficked persons and the remaining 10% are about there are the traffickers. That's it. That's not a lot of traffickers that are being caught in these stings, these investigations. But the trafficked persons, if they don't realize that they're being trafficked and they think they're doing this of their own volition because they have been made dependent on different substances or they have these credible threats, they don't want to tell somebody what they're going through. They don't want to identify as a victim. They don't want to be seen as weak. There's so many reasons why these people aren't coming out and saying, I need help. It's one of the hardest things in the world to do. I need help. So when we're looking at these trafficked persons, 45% of them, a lot of them are getting arrested. So the purchasers are getting an $80 to $120 fine, about the same as driving up to the limit line at a red light. And then they're released after they pay their fine. That's it. Okay, go about your life. Go do your thing. Trafficked persons get jail time, a permanent record, and then bailed out. And the traffickers, about 2% of them face prosecution. 2% of that 10% of the people that were arrested, 2%. So back to this, what happens with this? When the trafficked person is bailed out, it's usually by the person that's trafficking them who insists on being paid back the bail money. But where do you think that money comes from? In order to obtain a trafficking conviction, state laws in most instances require that prosecutors prove traffickers compelled their victims into labor or sexual servitude. The majority of laws include the elements force, fraud, and coercion, but the definition of these things can vary so much from one state to another. This is why victims are misidentified and prosecuted when what they need most is patience and assistance. So how long does it take? How long does someone have to report the crime? I did mention that the statute of limitations on sex trafficking is 2 years to report a rape or molestation within certain states. But in sex trafficking cases, it's currently just 5 years, even if it involves minors. The harm and trauma that's suffered by survivors of trafficking can cause survivors to withdraw and block out these acts and memories to the deepest recesses in their minds. I know this because I did it myself. For adults, many don't come forward until after their 18-month statute runs out. This law is different in every single state, every single country, and some nations don't have any laws against human trafficking at all. So putting it all together, nothing changes until the law changes. So if you're wanting to make a difference in the world, I would say find a reputable 501c3 that does the work. Look for one with a seal of transparency so you know where the money's going if you do donate to them. Ask an organization that works with survivors what they need. Ask them if they need toothbrushes, coats, toiletries, socks. If they don't need the stuff, they don't need your money. And get involved in legislature. Find out what human trafficking bills are coming up for a vote and fight. Go fight on the floor, speak up. And if you're looking for recommendations for different organizations to work with, I do have several. Start with Skull Games. This is a fantastic organization that's run by former special forces and former police who are now going around and training police on how to better manage, teaching their people on how to handle human trafficking cases, what signs to look for, all that stuff. Beautiful Feet Wellness is run by a very dear friend of mine, Jenny. She is a survivor herself, and she helps other survivors to transition out of that place of being a victim into a place of being a survivor that can thrive. Compass 31 is another organization that's just incredible. They're doing work all across the globe. And Jenny Sue, who is the founder of Compass 31, is another survivor. She is doing all the hard work and she needs as much help as possible. And the last one, Alight. They're the Alliance to Lead Impact in Global Human Trafficking. That's what Alight stands for. Alight is incredible. They have done wonderful work, even just for me. They paired me up with legal services to be able to go fight against the trafficking, against the trafficker, and against the stuff that exists out there in the world, trying to help me to reclaim my life after I got out of trafficking. That is it for the pre-presentation. I'm going to be taking questions here now in just a moment when I turn off this screen sharing. But if you want to get in touch with me and speak to me privately, I'm okay with that as well. I do have a contact form on my website. My website is growthfromdarkness.com. You can check out my YouTube channel if you want to see more videos about this or any of my podcasts. I'm going to hit that pause button now and I will go into the question section. All right, Nicole, I don't know if your audio ever came up, but I am concerned that you may have missed it, and I'm sorry. But it was just you and me the whole time, so hopefully that's okay. Let's turn off the screen share. Hi, I'm a person. Are you there? Can you hear me? It seems like maybe your system didn't like this idea of you joining me today, and I apologize for that. Let's see. I'm going to hit the chat button here just in case you haven't been able to hear me throughout this whole thing, and I will say to you what I'm typing at the same time. I'm going to post this full presentation on my YouTube channel so you can still hear it if you would like to later on. It was just you and I today. Appreciate you being here. Thank you. Okay. All right, Nicole, I'm going to sign off. It doesn't look like your computer's going to let you hang out with me today. I apologize for that. Bye.